Hello, and welcome to this special presentation on emotional trauma. My name is Jim Hardy, and for the last 9 years, I've been reading and speaking about the related subjects of addiction to drugs, also known as substance use disorder, or SUD, mass incarceration, the neuroscience of addiction, and issues related to SUD treatment. My goal is to raise awareness of the damage the 52-year-long drug war has done to our country and to show a better, more humane, and productive way to deal with these issues. I'm a retired teacher, and while I'm not credentialed in these areas, I've read widely and made every effort to present information that is scientifically accurate and current. This program is an overview of a complex subject about which we are still learning. For many reasons, I encourage you to do your own research and expand your own knowledge about what is presented tonight. Before we begin, I'd like to go, I talked about the handouts, so I would like to thank several people. First of all, I would like to thank the CARE Coalition, who sponsored this along with UTC, and CARE Coalition printed all the handouts that you received tonight. I'd also like to thank Kimberly Dunbar, who did all of the slides for this presentation. And finally, I'd like to thank Doug Wilkes and Catherine Burley, who are our AV techs and who are responsible for this recording and for what you're hearing tonight. Emotional trauma is part of the human condition. It surrounds us, and we're all affected by it, whether it's directly or indirectly. Emotional trauma is at the root of almost all human dysfunction and misery. Its effects drive violence, conflict in families and society, drug addiction, homelessness, mental illness, and suicide. Trauma sends millions to our jails and prisons, where the experiences there and after release simply add additional trauma. Trauma often makes it difficult or impossible for an individual to function in daily life, to get and hold a job, to relate to others and sustain a relationship, to deal with the many pressures and demands that are part of life. Despite trauma being a basic part of the human condition, until very recently we've been ignorant of how to understand and heal it. It has been stigmatized, cloaking it in the shame and silence that colors anything that relates to mental health issues. We just don't talk about it. The result is that those who suffer from trauma feel isolated and alone, unable to share with others the heavy burden they carry. Reaching out to others for help is a frightening experience, the fear being that others will judge them harshly as weak or flawed. Yet we now know that it is the reaching out, it's the connecting with others, even one other, that is the beginning of the healing process. NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, estimates that nearly half of the 60 million adults and children living with mental health conditions in the United States go without any treatment. Because of the stigma, this cloak of silence and shame, coupled with a lack of access to mental health resources, many don't get the help they need, the help that leads to healing. Even when people are willing to seek help, they often face huge barriers to getting it. There are no mental health resources close by, or insurance doesn't pay for mental health treatment, or the provider doesn't take that insurance. Despite huge advances in our learning about trauma and mental illness, we clearly have a long way to go. The time before 1980 might be considered the dark ages regarding trauma, misunderstanding, and treatment. It wasn't until then that PTSD was officially recognized by the U.S. military as a psychological disorder. The Kaiser Permanente Early Childhood Experiences, ACEs study in the early 90s opened a huge window on how these early experiences shape our lives. The functional MRI, invented in 1990, has given us a real-time look at the workings of the brain. Most scientists agree that we are just at the beginning of understanding how the brain works. So much of what you will hear tonight has been learned only recently, and not everyone is in complete agreement with all of it. In this program, I'll define trauma, including its causes and its effects. We'll examine the brain-body connection and how the brain works to process experience. We'll explore the normal workings of the stress response system and how it is disordered in trauma. We'll explain adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and the critical importance of early childhood experiences, both positive and negative. We'll define and explore the concept of resilience and how it can be developed to deal with trauma. And finally, we'll look at various pathways to healing and identify some community resources that provide support. And you have a lot of that information in the handout you got tonight. So let's define what we mean by emotional trauma. And by the way, not everybody agrees on an exact definition, but the one I'm going to give you is pretty general and common to most of the people who are dealing with this. Emotional trauma results from exposure to an incident or a series of incidents that are emotionally disturbing or life-threatening, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, and/or spiritual well-being. In other words, it really disrupts their life. Experiences that may be traumatic include, but are definitely not limited to, physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, childhood neglect, living with a family member with mental illness or substance use disorders, sudden unexplained separation from a loved one, poverty, racism, discrimination and oppression, violence in the community, war, or terrorism. These events can be a single experience, like a violent car crash or attack by a wild animal or person. That's called big T trauma, that one experience. Often, though, trauma results from a series of events spread over a long period of time, like childhood neglect or abuse. These are called little t trauma. Either can be extremely damaging and life-changing. Trauma is in the brain of the beholder. It's important to note that trauma results from the way a person responds to an event. In other words, trauma is not the event itself, but is formed by the way the person is affected by that event. Because each of us is unique in how we process experience, what is traumatizing to one person may not be traumatizing to another. Also, the degree to which a person is traumatized rests on a continuum from 0 to 100. Of greatest importance is the fact that the first few years of life shape our personality and worldview, and our resilience or lack of resilience to trauma. We'll dig deeply into that later in the presentation, but I will tell you that if everyone knew how important those first few years of life, from in the womb to age 3 or 4, we would completely change our culture, and we could eliminate much of the trauma that we see today. Each of us is unique in how we process experience. The effects of trauma can last for a long time, or they can come and go. With severe trauma, an individual might find they have difficulty with day-to-day aspects of their life, including looking after themselves, holding down a job, trusting others, maintaining friendships or relationships, remembering things and making decisions, coping with change, simply enjoying their life. The following is a list of specific effects that may apply to some individuals and not others, and may vary on how they're combined and the frequency with which they appear. Flashbacks. This is the one we normally think of with PTSD. Reliving aspects of a traumatic event or feeling as if it is happening now. So this is an event This is an event that took place in the past that was extremely traumatizing, but it suddenly comes up immediately, and the person feels like they're living it in the present. This is what we're used to thinking of as PTSD, and that's post-traumatic, after the trauma, stress system disorder. So the stress system is basic to our very survival. It's when that stress system becomes disordered that we have trauma. So other things, panic attacks, dissociation, and I'm going to talk about this later. Hyperarousal or hypervigilance. Severe trauma often leads people to be constantly on the lookout for danger. Those first few years program us to live a life in a world that looks like those first few years. So if that first few years is a positive experience, and that's dependent on the caregivers, you get the view of the world that things are good and safe and so on, and people are good and safe. But if you grow up in a traumatized environment, again, it's about the caretakers usually, always, and you see the world as dangerous and people as dangerous or unreliable, that's the way you will see the world for the rest of your life, unless things change, and it can change. Sleep problems, low self-esteem, self-harm, suicidal feelings, alcohol and substance abuse. And alcohol and substance abuse, and alcohol is a substance, I hate to separate them really, but it's all based in trauma. And feelings of self-blame, and this often happens to victims of early sexual abuse, is they have a choice of looking at their caregiver as wrong or flawed, or looking at themselves as wrong or flawed. Well, a little child, their default is, there's something wrong with me. I did something wrong. And this is what is so traumatizing and so isolating for people who have gone through those experiences. Trauma can occur at any age, but it's particularly debilitating long-term effects on children's developing brains, because our brain is being programmed to deal with life. Often referred to as adverse child experiences, or ACEs, exposure to these experiences is common across all of society. It doesn't matter socioeconomic group, whatever you want to say, it happens everywhere. Adults who experience trauma in childhood are often wired differently than those who did not. Their brains, primed to deal with nearly constant stress, can struggle to respond appropriately to situations that would otherwise appear normal and non-threatening. This partly explains why many adult trauma survivors struggle with depression, anxiety, and other issues related to emotional regulation. It's all about the emotions. These resulting mental health issues can contribute to long-term difficulties maintaining healthy relationships and lead to problems at home, at school, or at work. In The Body Keeps the Score, author Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, psychiatrist and neuroscientist, says, "One does not have to be a psychiatrist, combat soldier, or visit a refugee camp in Syria or the Congo to encounter trauma. Trauma happens to us, our friends, our families, and our neighbors, and also to our culture, by the way. Research by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has shown that 1 in 5 Americans was sexually molested as a child. 1 in 4 was beaten by a parent to the point of a mark being left on their body. And 1 in 3 couples engages in physical violence. 1/4 of us grew up with alcoholic relatives, and 1 of 8 witnessed their mother being beaten or hit. We're surrounded by trauma. Physical violence. Every minute, 20 men and women are physically abused by an intimate partner. That means there are nearly 10 million accounts of domestic or partner violence each year. On a typical day, there are more than 20,000 phone calls placed to domestic violence hotlines nationwide. Sexual violence. Over half of women and almost 1 in 3 men have experienced sexual violence involving physical contact during their lifetimes. 1 in 4 women and about 1 in 26 men have experienced completed or attempted rape. Mental illness. An estimated 26% of Americans aged 18 and older suffer from a diagnosable mental disorder. Almost half of Americans will experience an episode of mental illness in their lives. There are 4.5 million children in the United States diagnosed and living with anxiety. And if you've been in any reading at all, you hear more and more about anxiety in young people. By the way, I'm a member of TC Strong, which addresses that in our Transylvania County schools. Drugs. In 2021, over 98,000 people died from preventable drug overdoses, an increase of almost 800% since 1999. Much of that, of course, is related to fentanyl. I can't say eliminate it, but we could reduce that by probably 80% by changing our policies here. Sadly, that number continues to increase every year. I think it's around 110 now, or maybe a little higher than that. Child abuse. At least 1 in 7 children have experienced child abuse or neglect in the past year in this country. And suicide. Suicide is one of the leading causes of death in the United States. Suicide was responsible for over 48,000 deaths in 2021, which is about 1 death every 11 minutes. Trauma is rooted in the stress response. Stress is a normal and crucial part of our lives, and the stress response is designed to keep us alive and healthy. In fact, without the stress response system, we would die. This system alerts us to anything that could be harmful and prepares us to deal with and survive it. We feel some level of stress when we're late for work, can't remember where we parked the car, or someone in the family is sick. This kind of stress causes us to focus on dealing with the problem at hand and is normal and healthy when it lasts for short periods of time. Each of us lives with some degree of stress every day. Stress is a reaction to things happening within us and outside of us and has many causes. It's anything that triggers emotions related to fear. We feel anxious, irritable, nervous, and sometimes overwhelmed. When stress is severe and experienced repeatedly, we often feel isolated and alone. You probably experience regular, if not daily, doses of stress from things like the pandemic, another mass shooting, political division, deadlines at work, raising children, paying bills. Approximately 79% of Americans say they feel stressed sometimes or frequently every single day. For some, these issues are manageable. For others, they're not. For some, stress dominates their thoughts and feelings, crowding out other aspects of their lives and leading to severe anxiety and depression. It's at this point that we talk about trauma. Understanding trauma is really about understanding our brain, how it works, and why it works the way it does. So let's talk about our amazing brain. Scientists agree that our 3-pound brain, 3 pounds, sitting right here, is the most complex system discovered in our universe. Most of what we know about the brain has been discovered in the last 15 to 30 years, and new discoveries are being made almost daily. Experts agree that there is more that we don't know about the brain than we currently do know. And again, I urge you to Google some of this and read about it. It's just absolutely fascinating stuff. Most scientists estimate that the brain contains around 86 billion neurons, although some put it as high as 100 billion. And tonight I'm going to use that figure of 86 billion because that seems to be where most of them focus. Each neuron can transmit 1,000 nerve impulses per second, and make as many as tens of thousands of connections, of synaptic connections with other neurons. And those are the things that carry the nerve impulses, those synapses. It's now estimated that there are 100 trillion connections in our 3-pound brain. And a whole new area of neuroscience is now tracing those connections. Again, fascinating stuff. And by the way, in your handout, I have a whole 2-page thing on some of the facts about our brain, which you might be interested in. A piece of brain tissue the size of a grain of sand contains about 100,000 neurons, each and a billion synapses. Think about that. A piece of grain of sand, 100,000 neurons and a billion synapses. I can't conceive of that. I can't really conceive of that number, but it's just fascinating to me. And they're all communicating with each other. Our brain is designed for one thing: to enable us to live long enough and healthy enough to reproduce and pass on our genes. And by the way, we're not unique in this. All of life on this planet is designed around that same concept: to stay healthy long enough to pass on its genes. And that's plants as well as animals. According to neuroscientist Dr. Nell Sith in his book, Being You, the primary goal of any organism is to continue staying alive. All living organisms strive to maintain their physiological integrity in the face of danger and opportunity. This is why our brains exist. Evolutionarily speaking, the most fundamental reason any organism has a brain. By the way, this goes to scallops. I mean, truly, they have the same danger recognition that we do. It doesn't work exactly the same way, but it's designed the same way to do the same thing. It's to help us to stay alive, making sure that its physiological essential variables remain within the tight ranges compatible with its continued survival. In simpler terms, our brain is constantly working to keep our bodies in a healthy balance, something known as homeostasis. So when we're in balance, we're calm and we're comfortable, and as soon as we get out of balance, that's when we start to feel that stress. And that's on the positive side as well as the negative side. The most basic example of how the brain regulates our heart and respiration rate to match the physical demands of our body. Your heart rate and breathing slow down when you're asleep and increase when you're awake. They speed up even more when you're walking and even more when you're running. It's just how it works. That's the most basic part of our brains. Keeping us healthy also means keeping us safe. On the one hand, that means alerting us to danger and helping us cope with it. And on the other hand, it means leading us to those things that benefit us. To understand how the brain does this, we need to look at the limbic system. The brain's limbic system is located deep in the midbrain and evolved millions of years ago. Sometimes it's called the reptile brain, at least the amygdala part of it is, because reptiles have it. And you can trace it all the way up through the animal kingdom. And again, that part of, I'll talk about that in a minute. It's the most basic, it's part of most animal brains from reptiles on up, increasing in complexity as one moves toward humans. It includes the hippocampus, reward system, and amygdala, and has strong connections to the autonomic nervous system. We can't control it. It takes over when something happens. So it's beyond our ability to control, at least for the most part. Its function is to process and regulate emotion and memory, while also enabling us to learn to avoid harmful situations and behaviors and to repeat beneficial ones. Behavior, motivation, and long-term memory are shaped by the limbic system. In the book, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, Dr. Bruce Perry and Maya Salovitz, by Dr. Bruce Perry and Maya Salovitz, Dr. Perry says, experiences that decrease stress and enhance our survival tend to give us pleasure. Experiences that increase our risk usually give us a sensation of distress. The hippocampus is also part of the limbic system and is involved in long-term memory formation and memory retrieval. We have to remember these experiences or we're doomed to repeat them. If we don't remember them, if we don't learn, and memory is really learning and changes our brain, it's the memory that enables us to avoid the negative and repeat the positive. And all that's tied to emotions again. Located close to both the amygdala and the reward system, it stores the memories of both positive and negative experiences. This is essential to our very survival because we can remember which experiences to avoid and which ones to repeat. The reward system. This is the part that makes us feel good. The reward system functions to remember experiences that are perceived as beneficial to our well-being and motivates us to repeat them. So dopamine is really a motivator. We talk about dopamine as the reward thing, but there are other things that are going on. And by the way, this is a fairly complex system. I'm grossly oversimplifying all of this. But again, you can go check it out and read it for yourself. Dopamine activates the reward center of the brain, triggering pleasurable feelings like security, warmth, joy, and happiness. These feelings make us want to repeat the experience. Many experiences, including sex, shopping, food, and drugs, activate the reward system. Regarding food, the three key ingredients that produce reward are salt, sugar, and fat. Now think, well, think about all the foods you love, and I will guarantee you that one of those three things, salt, sugar, or fat, or a combination of those things, is involved. And those substances light up the same pleasure center as does cocaine. And MRIs enable us to see this in real time. So whether it's cocaine or whether it's sugar, that fudge brownie or whatever you like, same stuff's going on in the brain. The amygdala, that's the initiator of the stress response. This is the red flag that says there's something going on that you need to pay attention to, and it could be dangerous, could be life-threatening. When confronted by any perceived danger, threat, or challenge, our amygdala instantly triggers the stress response. This happens in milliseconds, truly milliseconds, which is designed to keep us alive and healthy by enabling us to fight or flee a life-threatening experience, whether it be a wild animal, a burning building, or crazed human attacker, or to a lesser degree, the many everyday problems that life throws at us. The goal is to survive the experience intact and not repeat it. The emotions most closely associated with this are fear-related and can range from a state of high alert to outright terror. And by the way, we go through this. Sometimes we go through it very quickly, sometimes not. The first step is alert. Something's going on, you need to pay attention to it. And then it progresses through that, depending on the experience. You smell smoke, all right? Immediately you're on alert. So first thing you're going to do is look where the smoke's coming from and what's going on. And you find out you burned the bread or whatever's in the oven, and so you take it out and you air the house out and you're okay. But it could be the house is on fire, whole different thing. At the first sign of danger, the amygdala instantly prepares the body to deal with the threat by triggering the release of adrenaline and cortisol into the blood system. And by the way, they're two very different chemicals that do different things. Adrenaline dramatically speeds up the heart rate and respiration and increases blood flow and sugar to the muscles of the arms and legs. Our body is now ready to fight or flee. So we've prepared our body physically to run or to fight. The response is automatic and happens without any conscious thought. In fact, that's a good thing. So in fact, when the amygdala is activated, the cortex and prefrontal cortex, the thinking parts of our brain, shut down. And so once that thing is triggered, and the stronger it is, the less we can think rationally. Think about what's going on in the Middle East right now. You're seeing the results of the amygdala and the limbic system. The stress response is meant to be temporary, quick on and quick off psychological state adaptive for survival. It's meant to exist for a very short period of time because all these chemicals put incredible stress on our organs. It mobilizes the brain and body to react to an immediate threat or challenge, and in doing so, puts a tremendous stress on the heart, lungs, and muscles. The intense fear-based emotions put great stress on the psyche as well. That's the emotional side of it. The event and associated emotions are stored in memory to be recalled when the brain senses the need to avoid a similar threat. Once the threat is over, cortisol shuts off the stress response, and the body returns to a calm, regulated state. And that, of course, is dependent on the threat being eliminated or dealt with. There's a third response. We always talk about fight or flight, but there's a third response. And it happens in all animals. It's called the dissociative response. And that differs markedly from fight or flight and happens when a person is facing grave danger and it is impossible for the person to fight or escape. Imagine being in the jaws of a grizzly bear or in a horrendous car crash or as a child being attacked by a terrifying caregiver. And much of that childhood trauma is sexually related. You have no control and you're totally helpless to respond. In this instance, the brain initiates a far different series of reactions. Again, Dr. Perry. During dissociation, the brain prepares the body for injury. Blood is shunted away from the lungs, and the heart rate slows to reduce blood loss from wounds. A flow of endorphins, those are our brain's natural heroin-like chemicals that make us feel good. That's part of the reward system. Is released, killing pain, producing calm, and a sense of psychological distance from what is happening. This often happens to children who are sexually abused. The person becomes completely focused inward. There is a sense that time is slowed and what's happening isn't real. People often report feeling emotionless and numb, as though they are watching what's happening to them affect a character in a movie. Please note that these descriptions have been shortened for time, and this is a brief overview. I've greatly simplified very complex biological brain processes. So I encourage you again to research this on your own and discover what's out there. Let's talk about the hippocampus and its role in memory, because it's really crucial. The key to our survival is to avoid dangerous situations and to repeat beneficial ones. We can't do this unless we can remember what's dangerous and what's beneficial. The brain center responsible for activating the billions of connections in the brain that creates a memory is the hippocampus, another key part of the limbic system. And by the way, our memories, we have feeling memories, we have emotional memories, we have sensual memories, all of our five senses. And those come from both inside and outside of us. And so there are tens of thousands of connections in the brain that are necessary for a single memory. I can't tell you how many, but a huge number. These billions of connections join the various parts of the brain responsible for interpreting all the signals, both internal and external, that our senses process every second of our lives. The outcome is that we remember numerous pieces of every experience, visual images, sounds, smells, physical feelings, and the emotions we felt. Although we weren't in actual physical danger, most of us have vivid memories of significant distressing moments in our national history. And by the way, I'm old enough to remember when Kennedy was shot and the Challenger exploding in 87 and things like that, many of the people I talk to have no conscious memory of that. But think about some of the things, 9/11, you know, all those kinds of things. And think about what you felt. Even though you were not part of that, you were not directly there, you still felt it and probably can remember many details that are associated with that particular memory. The effect of recalling vivid memories also applies to positive experiences. A special vacation or celebration, the birth of a child or grandchild, a romantic evening. Thinking of an intensely positive experience reignites the same sensory details and emotions you felt originally. With respect to trauma, the more intense the negative experience, the more likely it can be reactivated instantly or triggered by any element of the experience, a smell or a sound or a visual image. The body then reacts as it did during the original experience by flooding the system with the stress hormones of adrenaline and cortisol. In effect, the person relives the experience as if it is actually happening in the moment, including feeling all the fear-based emotions. This is the classic description of PTSD and ACEs. A dramatic example of how the stress responses can be triggered is described in the book What Happened to You by Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey, which came out just a year ago, I think, or a year and a half ago. Dr. Perry was working with a 13-year-old boy named Jesse, who was in a deep coma caused by being thrown down a flight of stairs by his abusive foster father. Jesse was in the last of many foster homes because when he was 5 years old, police discovered that he had been prostituted by his abusive family. And by the way, this was a cultural thing in the family. This kind of behavior went back generations. Jesse had 2 sets of traumatic memories. During the early sexual attacks at age 4, he was unable to fight or flee and therefore dissociated. During physical abuse by his foster parents, he went into fight or flight mode. Dr. Perry was able to obtain unwashed clothing from both the biological father and the foster father. Despite being in a coma, Jesse had a notable physiological response when exposed to the scent of the 2 men. And by the way, this was measured by his heart rate. Okay. So when Dr. Perry placed the clothing from the foster father under his nose, Jesse started to thrash and moan, and his heart rate rose from his normal 90 beats per minute to 162, indicating he was in fight or flight mode. When exposed to the clothing from his biological father, his heart rate initially rose and then plummeted to below 60 beats per minute, a classic sign of the dissociative response. Isn't that something? The brain is always on alert. Right now, this second, you are processing everything in this environment, and your brain is telling you either this is safe or this is something you need to pay attention to. Every single second. We're constantly assessing relative safety or danger and comparing them with the details of past experiences and responding accordingly. And here's where memory comes into play. In The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, Dr. Perry makes the following observations. Memory is the capacity to carry forward in time some element of experience. That's memory. The brain creates associations when 2 patterns of neural activity occur repetitively and simultaneously. For example, you see a fire truck and you hear a siren at the same time. Well, if this is repeated over and over again, eventually just hearing the siren will bring up the image of a fire truck. That's association. Your brain is constantly checking current experience against stored templates, essentially memory, of previous situations and sensations, asking, is this new? And is this something I need to attend to? Your brain filters out the ordinary and expected, but holds on to unique and important experiences, both positive and negative. Its goal is to help us avoid experiences that harm us and cause us to repeat experiences that benefit us. For example, you've brushed your teeth many thousands of times. How many of those times do you remember? Do you remember last Tuesday when you brushed your teeth after lunch? Probably not. But the only time you might remember it is while you were brushing your teeth and a huge tree fell on your house and caved in the roof above you. You will definitely remember that. It's important to understand that our default system is set to suspicion. We're always on the alert for danger. So we're programmed to look for that. At a minimum, when faced with a new and unknown pattern of activity, we become more alert. If the experience is familiar and known as safe, the brain's stress system will not be activated. However, if the incoming information is initially unfamiliar, new or strange, the brain instantly begins the stress response. How extensively the stress response system is activated is related to how threatening the situation appears to be. The brain's goal is to get more information, to examine the situation and determine just how dangerous it might be. Since humans have always been the deadliest animal encountered by other humans, we closely monitor nonverbal signals of human menace, such as tone of voice, facial expression, and body language. Whenever is different puts us on alert and may trigger the stress response system. Think about the implications to this for dealing with people who are different than we are. We're immediately on alert. Our brain is programmed to do that. So it's only when the thinking part, the cortex and prefrontal cortex, can override that. But if you're just dealing on that limbic system level, you can imagine what happens. Your brain is you, and it is unique in all creation. Think about that. From the time it begins forming in the womb, and that's a key part of the whole thing, your brain is changing both physically and electrochemically every second as it processes the vast number of sensory inputs from within and outside the body. The more you experience, the more your wiring changes. And wiring is sort of it's not exactly right, but that's the concept. This is how we learn. We used to think that the brain never changed. Well, if the brain never changed, we'd never learn. We couldn't. So it's constantly changing. And it plays a key role in determining our personality and how we see the world. In fact, it's what enables us, or what makes us us, and gives us our own unique viewpoint. Right now, at this very moment, your brain contains the sum total of your experience from the beginning in the womb until right this second. Remembered and forgotten. Thus, brains are like fingerprints. No two people have exactly the same brain anatomy. Your brain is the only one in the world like it because of your genetics and all the unique experiences that you have influenced your brain development. And the first few years are crucial. From birth to age 3, I should change that, from conception to age 3. A child's brain develops more and more rapidly than at any other time in life. To arrive at the more than 86 billion neurons that are normal complement of a newborn baby, and the baby is born with that number, the brain must grow at the rate of about 250,000 nerve cells a minute on average throughout the course of pregnancy. So pregnancy is an incredibly important part of who we become. In a 12 to 14 week embryo, nerve cells are proliferating at the rate of about 15 million per hour. Think about that. At birth, the human body already has about all the neurons it will ever have. It physically doubles in size the first year, and by age 3 it has reached 80% of its adult volume. Think about that, 80% of its adult volume by age 3. Even more importantly, synapses are formed at a faster rate during these years than at any other time. And of course, synapses are the spaces between two neurons that transmit the nerve impulses. And there's a whole chemical electrical process that's involved in that. Again, very complex, and we're still figuring it out. But again, you can check that out on your own. Without the connections in our brains would not work without those synapses. From the very earliest moments of your existence in the womb, you're learning about the world around you and your place in it. This learning shapes everything about you, your ability or inability to learn language, connect with others, process what's going on around you. In short, your very personality and your view of the world. Essentially, this learning is designed to enable you to succeed throughout life by shaping your brain and body to deal with a world that is like the one you are now experiencing. That's how we're designed. Not only is your brain changing based on what's happening to you, but some of your very genes are changing as well. The science of epigenetics explores how our environment can modify our genes for good or ill. And again, this is another whole new field of science, only in the last probably 20 years. And by the way, those changes can happen not just to an individual, they can be passed on to future generations. So there is a whole science of cultural trauma that goes on. Think about somebody who grew up black, for example, African American, and that whole history and how that has shaped their worldview. So that is, and again, you can read about this. One of the handouts talks about that. Your interaction with caregivers, those responsible for meeting your needs and keeping you alive, forms the basis of how you see and relate to others and how you see the world. Nurturing positive interactions with caregivers establish a view of the world as a place of promise and opportunity. Abusive or neglectful interactions with caregivers create distrust of others and a view that the world is a place of conflict and turmoil. While genetics play a significant role, and they do, scientific research has made clear that the quality of a child's experiences in the first few years of life, positive or negative, helps shape how their brain develops, and that these experiences have lasting impact on their health and ability to learn and succeed in school and life. By the way, if you're Googling some of this and want to learn more about it, look at the experiments with licking rats. Rats that lick their offspring versus rats that don't. Very interesting stuff. From the time you begin developing in the womb through the first several years, you're helpless and totally dependent on others to keep you alive and well. You feel stress every time you are hungry, uncomfortable, in pain, or feeling insecure. You cry for attention and relief. Over time, how soon and how well your stress is relieved by your caregivers shapes your view of the world and your relationship with others. This kind of bond, or lack of bond, you develop with your caregivers, usually your parents, will shape your personality and determine your worldview. If you're nurtured and loved and comforted when needed, you will see others as trustworthy and have a positive outlook on life. If you're neglected and or abused, you will view others with distrust and apprehension, and the world is a dangerous place. While trauma can happen later in life, it is the trauma of the early years that is deepest, longest lasting, and most impacts the individual. It's important to note that even the deepest and most profound trauma can, with the right support and guidance, be healed. And healing, we'll talk about healing later, because it doesn't mean erasing the memory or anything like that. I'll tell you about that later. It's also important to note that even in the most stressful circumstances, one single nurturing person can enable an individual to avoid trauma or reduce its impact. Think of the stories you've heard from athletes, for example, that talk about a grandmother or an aunt who took care of them and really got them through very difficult circumstances. One person can make the difference. Finally, each individual processes experience in their own way, and some are more susceptible to trauma than others. As mentioned before, stress is a normal part of life and is designed to keep us safe and healthy. According to Dr. Perry, stress is not something to be afraid of or avoided. It is the controllability, pattern, and intensity of stress that can cause problems. Moderate, predictable, and controllable activation of the stress response system leads to a more flexible, stronger stress response capability that lets a person demonstrate resilience in the face of more extreme stressors. Like weightlifting, we exercise the system to make it stronger. The more we face moderate challenges and succeed, the more capable we are of facing bigger challenges. This is what is meant by the word resilience. Those who live with severe trauma are intermittently or constantly under significant physical and emotional stress. Often and without warning, the amygdala triggers the stress response and the body is flooded with adrenaline and cortisol, increasing the heart rate, breathing rate, and blood pressure, thus inflaming and stressing many organs of the body. This is especially intense when a person experiences flashbacks in which the memory of a traumatic experience is triggered by a sound or smell or some other element of the experience, and the person relives the experience even though no actual threat exists in the present. The trigger can instantly and without warning bring back the full trauma of the original event. This can happen at any time of the day or night and happen over and over, day after day, week after week, year after year. And you can see how this will wear a person down. This concept is beautifully illustrated by San Francisco pediatrician Nadine Burke Harris in the movie Resilience, in which she has you imagine a hike in the woods on a beautiful day. Suddenly, you're confronted by a very large bear. However it happens, you're not attacked. Of course, some would be traumatized and would perhaps never hike again. But many people, perhaps most, would not be traumatized, at least over the long term, and it would not cause great distress to them, and that memory would fade over time. In fact, it might be just a great story that they love to tell later on. She asks you then to imagine that the bear, which is symbolic of a severely traumatic event, exists in your mind 24 hours a day. At any time, it can suddenly and unexpectedly appear in front of you in full threat mode, triggering the terror and full-blown stress response of the actual experience. And this is where we really talk about trauma. It's that, and you never know what's going to happen. Each time the person relives the experience, the higher level thinking parts of the brain, the cortex and prefrontal cortex, shut down, and the individual feels all the intense, fear-based emotions brought on by the original experience. The emotional toll of constantly experiencing the effects of strong stress response has long-lasting adverse effects on the individual's mental, social, emotional, and or spiritual well-being. This can include persistent fatigue, sleep disorders, nightmares, fear of recurrence, anxiety focused on flashbacks, depression, and avoidance of emotions, sensations, or activities that are associated with the trauma. This is where the person withdraws. The individual withdraws from those who are closest and seeks comfort in addictions like work or drugs. Some alternate between deep depression and violent outbursts, and suicide often results. We lose a number of our veterans every single day to suicide, along with many other people. The physical toll is just as damaging. Long-term exposure to stress hormones strains many of the body's systems and can lead to serious health problems like heart disease, diabetes, and cancer. The ACEs study found that an ACE score of 6 or more, and this is on the 10-question test which you have, can shorten life by as much as 20 years. And that's not just due to lifestyle changes. That's due to the physical strain on the body. So let's talk about ACEs. The CDC's Adverse Child Experiences study, done in 1995 or in the middle 90s, uncovered a stunning link between childhood trauma and the chronic diseases people develop as adults, as well as the social and emotional problems that result. This includes heart disease, lung cancer, diabetes, and many autoimmune diseases, as well as depression, violence, being a victim of violence, and and suicide. It found that ACEs are at the root of nearly all problems of physical, mental, economic, and social health in humans, no matter where in the world those humans live, and no matter their socioeconomic class, educational level, or racial cultural identity. It doesn't matter. None of those, it happens to all. This study is one of the largest investigations of childhood abuse and neglect and the resulting household challenges and problems with later life health and well-being. The study's participants were 17,000, this is the original study now. Study's participants were 17,000, mostly white, middle and upper class, college-educated San Diegans with good jobs and great health care. The study was initiated by Kaiser Permanente in California. The participants were given a confidential survey which asked a series of questions about potentially traumatic events they may have experienced below the age of 18. There are, of course, many types of childhood trauma: racism, bullying, watching a sibling being abused, losing a caregiver, homelessness, surviving and recovering from a severe accident or illness, involvement with the foster care or juvenile justice systems. But the study developed a 10-question survey of the 10 most frequently mentioned events. The survey has since been used and studied across diverse populations around the world, and the reliability and consistency of results has been validated many times. This survey is now the gold standard for measuring childhood trauma. So let's look at the key findings here. Of dozens of studies have shown that ACEs are quite common, even among middle and upper class populations. More than 2/3 of the population, any population by the way, has experienced at least one ACE, and nearly a quarter have experienced 3 or more. The ACE score captures the cumulative negative impact on social, emotional, and cognitive development, and other impairments in the function of brain and body systems. These impairments are the biologic pathways to health risks, disability, disease, and early mortality. The higher the ACE score, the greater the risk of heart disease, diabetes, obesity, depression, substance abuse, smoking, poor academic achievement, time out of work, and early death. 3 or more ACEs doubles the risk of developing heart disease. 4 or more triples the risk of developing depression. As noted earlier, 6 or more can lower life expectancy by 20 years. At least 5 of the top 10 causes of death are associated with ACEs. I should point out that the ACE score is meant as a guide, not a diagnosis. Remember, each person reacts in their own way. So the figures are general in nature. An individual experience may differ significantly. Each person is unique, and some people with high ACEs scores never suffered trauma as a result, while others with low scores had severe trauma. Although I would suggest that those with high ACEs scores had one person in their life who provided the necessary support to enable them to deal with what they were dealing with. People who have experienced significant adversity or many ACEs are not irreparably damaged. There is a spectrum of potential responses to ACEs and their possible chain of developmental harm. The most important thing to remember is that the ACE score is meant as a guideline. If you experienced other types of toxic stress over months or years, then those could likely increase your risk of adverse health consequences depending on your own personal responses to those events. Everyone's different, and adverse experiences in childhood affect each child differently. Just because a person has experienced several ACEs does not mean that later social, emotional, or health problems are inevitable. Some children develop resilience, the ability to overcome serious hardship, while others do not. And of course, genetic factors also play a part. Thus, the ACEs quiz can only give us insight into who might be at risk, not who is at risk for certain later life changes. So let's take a look at this survey. You have your handout, and I'm going to ask you, I'm going to read these too because we're recording this, so some people can't see. We'll see the survey up on the screen there. So I'm going to go through these while you look at them. And you don't have to share this with anybody. You don't have to do it now if you don't want to. But this might give you some insight. And I've talked to people who have taken this who said, I forgot all about this. It made me remember something that I had repressed or had forgotten long, long ago. So let's start. All this is before your 18th birthday. Did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you? Or act in a way that made you afraid that you might be physically hurt? Did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you? Ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? Did an adult or person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you, or have you touch their body in a sexual way, attempt or actually have oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse with you? Did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special? Or your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? Did you often or very often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, and had no one to protect you? Or your parents were too drunk or high to take care of you or take you to the doctor when you needed it? Were your parents ever separated or divorced? Was your parent or caregiver often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at him or her? Sometimes, often, or very often kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard, or ever repeatedly hit over at least a few minutes, or threatened with a gun or knife? Did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic, or who used street drugs? Was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide? Did a household member go to prison? So the number of yes answers is your ACEs score. And again, I want you to remember that the ACEs score can only give you insight into who might be at risk, not who is at risk for certain life challenges. And I want you also to remember that even severe trauma can be healed, or at least reduced, with the proper approach and support. So trauma formation depends on the individual and the event. Individuals perceive things differently, as I've said several times here. One person may shrug off an experience that is severely traumatic to another. Worldview established early in life matters. One who views the world as a dangerous place is more likely to suffer trauma than one who sees the world as nurturing and beneficial. In other words, in some ways, they're almost looking for it, or at least they're more susceptible to it. Those already traumatized are at greater risk for future trauma. Those who have successfully weathered stressful events in the past have developed a resilience that makes them better able to avoid trauma in the future. And the closer a person is to the event, and the more intensely they feel threatened and feel a loss of control, the greater the likelihood of trauma. Let's talk about resilience. Emotional resilience is the ability to adapt to a stressful situation and cope with life's ups and downs. It doesn't eliminate stress or ease life's difficulties, but allows you to tackle or accept problems, live through adversity, and move on with life. More resilient people can roll with the punches and adapt to adversity without lasting difficulties. They can put events in perspective and maintain a feeling of control. And that feeling of control is at the root of much of this. It's that once you start processing trauma, and part of the healing process is gaining control over the experience. And it's that loss of control that makes people feel vulnerable and isolated. Resilience can increase over time as one gains experience and success in dealing with life's problems. Research shows that those who deal with minor stresses more easily can also manage major crises with greater ease. So resilience has benefits for daily life as well as the rare major catastrophe. And resilience can be taught. and is being taught to its members and families by the U.S. Army. And by the way, our Transylvania school systems are instituting resilience-based training for our students. Schools are incorporating resilience programs, as I mentioned, and TC Strong is a major part of that. The path to healing means changing the question. Our medical system, and I'm not attacking it here, but this is the way it's always worked, or most always worked, is first of all, it separates the mind and the body. It deals with symptoms, not causes. And that's a key piece here. So doctors are beginning, as they're more trauma-informed, beginning to look at the life of the patient that they're talking to, not just the particular symptoms that show at that moment. That's a key difference. So instead of, it means changing the question. Instead of asking what's wrong with you, which is about what medicine's all about, and school is about, almost anything you can, it's about looking at the symptoms. So a kid's acting up in class, he's ADHD. Give him Ritalin. And what happens is, and that happens a lot, kid may not be ADHD, maybe processing a traumatic experience. And so by doing that, you're loading up with the kid with the wrong stuff, and you're not getting to the root cause of the behavior. You're just addressing the symptoms, which does nothing to change that root cause. So the question should be, what happened to you? I mean, think about how important that difference is. As described in the recent book, What Happened to You by Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey, doing so causes the treatment to focus not only on symptoms, what's wrong with you, but on the underlying cause of those symptoms. What happened to you? Sadly, much treatment today, and again, this is the way it's been for hundreds of years probably, deals with symptoms rather than causes, and separates brain and body. So you go to a mental health professional to deal with the mental stuff, you go to a medical doctor to deal with the physical stuff, but somehow they miss the connection. But that's changing. Healing is possible and available. It doesn't erase the traumatic memory. We've got to make that clear. Healing does not mean getting rid of the memory. It means putting the experience in perspective, enabling the person to gain a measure of control over it. That's the difference. With proper support, even severe trauma can be healed or at least reduced. Healing begins with realizing that you are not alone and works on restoring or building a positive self-image, which often suffers as a result of that initial trauma, especially with sexual abuse and neglect. Dr. Perry emphasizes that healing and recovery are impossible even with the best medication and therapy in the world without lasting, caring connections to others. Establishing connections to others is the fundamental key that creates everything else. And it happens in healing happens in professional therapy sessions, which we often think about, but it also happens in small incidents in daily life as one interacts with those who are empathetic and care about them. Trauma often makes one feel isolated and cut off from everyone. Self-worth is often diminished, accompanied by feelings of guilt and shame. Fearing discovery or blame from others, the traumatized individual avoids contact with others. Stigma. Go back to that stigma again. And that's one of the reasons I do this, is to overcome that stigma and get rid of it, because it stands in the way of so much positive healing, not only in all of this area. Close connection to a single supportive person can provide the means to healing or avoiding trauma in the first place. And the beginning of healing is the discovery that you are not alone and reaching out to someone else. So, finding help. Your handout, the first handout they have, the thinner one, has a number of resources in this area that provide mental health support and help, all kinds of connections. You see some connections up here. There are places that you can call if you're in crisis or if someone close to you is in crisis, that are available by a very quick phone call. And we have all kinds of mental health resources here, and many of them are documented in the handout that you got. So that's it. I'd like to invite your questions or your thoughts.
Wow, that was a fabulous summary of everything that I needed to know.
I'm gonna have you do the microphone because nobody will hear you on the recording, and I'd want to make sure that people can hear.
Dan and I have been dealing with a severely traumatized young man, and we've been working with it. He has for many, many years, and I have for 3 years. And this really summarizes beautifully for us what we see happening as this young man feels safe in the environment that he's in and has gained good resources through the Meridian program here in Brevard.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
I wanted to ask if you've had any experience or if you have any knowledge of Dr. Peter Levine. He has a website called traumahealing.com, and he deals with somatic experiencing, the body memory of the trauma and releasing it through physical activity. It's just a resource that I'm really familiar with in my work with clients, and an effective way to release the physiological aspects of trauma.
Thank you. I should point out that there are a number of ways that therapy is done, and what works for one person doesn't necessarily work for another person. This is another really important thing that I learned early on in dealing with substance use disorder and treatment, is that one type of therapy or one type of system or something works very well for some people and is actually counterproductive for others. And I'm not going to mention any. There's one that stands out in my mind, but I'm not going to get into that tonight. But so it really has to be tailored to the individual, and it has to be sensitive to the needs of the individual. There's also, we're seeing more and more what's called trauma-informed therapy. Not everybody sees trauma in the same way, and that's true with the therapist too. And so some trauma-informed therapy is probably more effective than others. And again, it's very important to look at the person who's providing that therapy and assess whether it's working for you or for the person who is close to you. Tara?
Is there an instrument that measures the parallel of what ACEs are for the 18 and over age group? So you're looking at adverse adult experiences.
Well, certainly we can suffer a severe traumatic experience at any point in life, right up to the end of life. And I guess the thing with the ACEs is that they have found that trauma that happens below 18 is so damaging and so pervasive and so impactful on a person's life. But that doesn't discount, I mean, you look at soldiers who go into war, for example, who are usually at least 17 or 18, although in some African countries they're 10 and 11 or even younger sometimes. And so that one war experience, and by the way, some of the books that I have listed here describe in great detail some of those experiences that people have had in war. And I won't go into all of that here. But the point is that trauma can happen to a traumatic experience can happen to any of us at any time. And much of how we respond to that depends on those first few years of life.
And then second quick question, if you had to say the top 5 things we can be doing to heal from trauma, or rather to reduce or negate the impact trauma has on our lives today, what would those top 5 things be?
Well, I'm not sure I can give you 5, and probably I might give you different ones at different times, and you probably get different answers from different people. But off the top of my head, I would say the very first thing is to be aware of what's going on in your own self. Be sensitive to what you're feeling and what you're thinking all the time. That's the first thing. The second thing is to be empathetic and listen to the people close to you, around you, and what they're experiencing. And just listen. Just listen. Don't try to change it. Don't give them, I mean, I'm famous for coming up with all kinds of solutions to problems, all right? And I'm learning over time to be a better listener about that. And sometimes people just need to be heard. And so the key thing is just not say anything and just listen. The third thing is to learn, to keep learning about this. Because we're all learning. I mean, the scientists are still learning about this. We're still on basically the ragged edge of the beginning of really understanding all of this. The fourth is to share your knowledge with other people. If everyone knew how critical those first few years are, we would be funding all kinds of programs to support pregnant women and early childhood. I mean, huge amounts. And we would be educating everyone about the importance of how you care for your children before they had children. And fifth, start advocating to your government representatives, because none of this is going to change until enough people want it to change. So there's my list. Other questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
So, in my experience, my understanding is that most people understand flashbacks to be of what we've seen in Hollywood, which is the visual flashbacks.
Yes.
Could you further detail the differences between those kinds of flashbacks, which are very real, and somatic and emotional flashbacks?
Well, they're all emotional. All of it boils down to the feelings that you have, or the feelings the person has from that experience, and re-experiencing those feelings. And those feelings are primarily fear-based, which go all the way from mild concern all the way to outright terror. I remember I was in the Air Force from 1967 to 1971, and I was stationed at Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii. And my wife and I, when we first got there, we were in temporary housing in a motel, and it was Christmas time. And we watched a guy. We could see a parking lot below us, and we watched a guy walking across the parking lot, and all of a sudden some firecrackers went off, and he dove under a car. Okay, and that's just a classic example. It may not have been PTSD, but many of the people we saw and encountered were people who were coming on R&R from Vietnam and Southeast Asia, and had traumatic war experiences. So that's an example of, but it all boils down to the feelings.
Right. So I know like complex PTSD specifically is not diagnosable. It's not in the DSM-5. But all the research that I've read about complex PTSD is that if they're having a flashback, somebody with complex PTSD is having a flashback, it's going to look a little bit different than somebody who has PTSD from one specific incident, because their responses are not being traced to anything specific. And so it can be confusing for the person with it and everyone involved. And I was wondering if you had anything else.
Well, what I would respond is that everybody's unique in how they respond. And so what you see in one person, or even in one instance, may be different than what you'd see from that person in a different instance or a different circumstance. So trying to diagnose or or figure it out, I guess, is difficult. But what you really need to do is get to know the person deeply over time, and they need to let go of that. They need to talk about it. And many people who have had terrible war experiences, one of the things about about trauma is that it's very painful. And so people do everything they can to avoid that pain, which means pushing that memory and that feeling down and pulling back from other people. I've read, again, you can look at the books that I use for this talk, but you'll see stories about men who came back from war and beat their spouses and were just totally isolated from their kids. Not that, because part of it was shame and guilt. There's one story about a man whose closest friend, who saw him killed in front of him, and the next day he shot up some enemy people who were civilians. And so he came back not only with the pain of watching his close friend die in front of him, but also the guilt and shame of what he did the next day. And so this is what leads to isolation and ultimately to suicide or to serious substance abuse issues. I don't know if that answers your question, but yes, go ahead.
I was interested in what you were saying about the body-mind connection, and I think you're right that we don't really pay attention to that as much as we should. And I was just going to say that my grandfather was born in 1895 and as a very young man served in World War I. And I mean, I don't know that his experience there was any more horrific than anybody else's, but it was a pretty horrible war. So he came home and he'd had a good childhood living on a farm and whatever. And actually, for most of his life, he didn't talk about the war. I don't think he was actively traumatized by the war. His war experiences all the time. I mean, there was no evidence that he was. But when he was over 100 years old, he physically became much diminished and ended his life in a nursing home. And while he was there, he had terrible nightmares about the war. I think for the first time in his life, and I think it's because, the mind-body connection, his body was breaking down, and whatever resources he had for resilience for the rest of his life, he didn't have any more. And I mean, he was really tormented in like the last 6 months of his life, reliving, I think, these terrible experiences from the war that somehow he'd been able to maybe section off or put aside for, the previous 90 years or however long.
It's hard to tell, what was going on in his mind, but I would think, based on what I've read, that he was definitely traumatized in the war, and that his way of dealing with it was to, as you said, section it off and not deal with it. And that happens to a lot of people. There's a book, and I can't remember the title of it, that's studied in the National War College. And it's written by a military man, and it's about teaching people to kill when they get into the service, and how resistant the majority of people who put on a uniform are to killing another human being, and how they have to be taught to overcome that resistance. And so I would suggest that that's traumatizing in itself for many people, maybe most people. So I would think that he was definitely traumatized in whatever way, maybe that in that way or in other ways, and just sectioned it off. And that's why many veterans who come back from the war just don't talk about it. Any other questions, comments? Well, thank you all for being here and for your attention. You've been a great audience, and I hope I've added something to your knowledge about all of this. And thank you so much. And again, go look at the stuff I've given you, because I've given you a lot of information here, including resources within this area for help, and learn more about it. To me, it's an exciting, fascinating area that we're just beginning to learn about. So thank you again. I hope you have a great evening.